my favorite things about fantasy is that it could be absolutely anything. You can read about dragons and ancient kingdoms one week, and the next you can pick up a book about vampires hiding in modern-day Chicago, or soldiers fighting magical wars with muskets instead of swords. The problem is that fantasy has so many subgenres that it can start to feel overwhelming. You've probably heard terms like urban fantasy, paranormal fantasy, and heroic fantasy, and thought, what do those actually mean? And more importantly, how do I know which ones I will actually enjoy? And that's exactly why I started this series, because I don't think that genres should feel like homework. They should actually help you discover your next favorite book. So today we're breaking down 4 fantasy subgenres that readers mix up all the time: urban fantasy, paranormal fantasy, Flintlock Fantasy, and heroic fantasy. We'll talk about what makes each one unique, who I think will love it, some common tropes you'll see over and over again, and of course, where I think you should start reading. So let's dive into one of the most recognizable and probably one of the most misunderstood fantasy genres out there: urban fantasy. Even if you've never heard the term urban fantasy before, there's a good chance that you've actually already read it or at least watched it. It's actually becoming one of the most popular ways to tell a fantasy story because it really just asks one simple question: what if magic existed in the world that we're living in right now? So what is urban fantasy? At its core, urban fantasy is fantasy that's set in our modern world. Instead of creating an entirely new fantasy realm, urban fantasy takes places we already know, like cities, suburbs, college campuses, and even small rural towns, and asks us to imagine that magic has been there hiding all along. Maybe the abandoned subway station beneath your city is home to an entire magical society. Maybe the quiet bookstore downtown is actually run by witches. Maybe vampires have been living among us for centuries, and most people have no idea. That's really the heart of urban fantasy. It's not about escaping to another world. It's about discovering that our world might be stranger than we ever imagined. So what makes it feel different from other fantasy subgenres? I think urban fantasy is so appealing because it already feels incredibly accessible. With epic fantasy, you're usually learning like a brand new world from scratch. New maps, new kingdoms, new histories, sometimes even new languages. Urban fantasy skips all of that. You already understand the world. You know what the city looks like. You know how cell phones work. You know coffee shops and universities and hospitals and apartment buildings. The author doesn't actually have to build an entirely new society. Instead, they get to ask, what if magic had been here all along and we just never noticed it? That familiarity makes it one of the easiest fantasy subgenres for new readers to actually jump into. So let's talk about one of the biggest misconceptions about this genre. Despite the name, urban fantasy doesn't actually have to take place in a big city. When the genre first became popular, many stories were set in places like Chicago, London, or New York, which is where the name urban fantasy really comes from. But today, most readers use urban fantasy much more broadly. As long as the story takes place in our contemporary world, it can actually fit in this genre. So think small towns, college campuses, quiet coastal communities, even isolated rural areas. The important part isn't the city. It's the setting feels like the world that we already live in. Okay, so let's talk about who will actually love urban fantasy. So if you've always been curious about fantasy but feel really intimidated by the giant maps, the complicated world building, or the massive multi-book series, urban fantasy is actually one of the best places for you to start. I'd also recommend it to readers who enjoy mysteries, thrillers, or crime novels. One of the things I love about urban fantasy is that it often borrows from other genres. You'll find magical detectives solving impossible murders, private investigators trapping supernatural criminals, or dark academia stories hiding occult societies beneath prestigious universities. Fantasy can be mixed with horror, it can be mixed with romance, or it can even be mixed with police procedurals. There's an incredible amount of variety here in this genre. So if you're reading urban fantasy, here are probably a few things that you'll consistently run into: hidden magical societies, secret supernatural governments, ancient vampires blending into modern life, witches running businesses that look perfectly ordinary, monster hunters, magical detectives, fairy courts operating behind the scenes. powerful artifacts hidden in museums or libraries, and protagonists who accidentally discover that there's an entire magical world that they have been living inside of their entire lives. Okay, so where should you start if you want to start diving into urban fantasy? If you want one of the most defining series in this genre, The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher is probably the place to begin. It follows a professional wizard who works as a private investigator in modern day Chicago, and it really helps shape what many readers think of when they hear the term urban fantasy. If you're looking for something more darker and academic, Ninth House by Lee Bardugo blends secret societies, occult magic, and murder mysteries on Yale campuses. If you're looking for something more literary and ambitious, The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin imagines cities themselves as living, breathing beings, creating one of the most unique takes on urban fantasy that I have ever read. So, if you're wondering whether urban fantasy is for you, think about the shows and the movies that you already love. If you're a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Supernatural, Lucifer, Constantine, or even Wednesday, you've already experienced many of these ideas that define urban fantasy. They're all asking some version of the same question. What if the supernatural was just hiding beneath the surface of everyday life? So, my personal take is that I actually think urban fantasy is one of the easiest gateways into fantasy as a whole. It gives you everything people love about the genre: magic, unforgettable creatures, incredible adventures, but it keeps one foot firmly planted in a world that you already recognize. You don't have to memorize a map before diving into chapter one. You don't need a glossary in the back of the book. You simply have to be willing to believe that the ordinary world might be hiding something extraordinary. And honestly, I think that's a very magical place to begin. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed something that I said about urban fantasy. Almost every urban fantasy book I just mentioned includes vampires, ghosts, witches, demons, or some sort of supernatural creature. So doesn't that make them paranormal fantasy too? Well, sometimes. And that's exactly where things start to get confusing. The good news is that once you understand what each genre is trying to do, telling them apart becomes a whole lot easier. So, what is paranormal fantasy? At its core, paranormal fantasy is fantasy that is built around the supernatural. That might mean ghosts, vampires, werewolves, psychics, haunted houses, demons, angels, curses, or any other force that exists beyond the natural world. Unlike urban fantasy, which is primarily defined by its setting, paranormal fantasy is defined by what drives the story. The supernatural isn't just part of the world, it really is the story. So, what makes this different from other genres? I think the easiest way to understand paranormal fantasy is to ask yourself one single question: what is the story really about? In urban fantasy, the story often begins with the idea that magic exists alongside everyday life. You're exploring a hidden magical version of the world that we already know. In paranormal fantasy, the focus really shifts. The story isn't about discovering a hidden magical society, it's about confronting the supernatural itself. Maybe it's a family haunted by generations of curses. Maybe it's a woman discovering that she's descended from witches. Maybe it's a vampire trying to survive in a changing world. Maybe it's even a haunted house that refuses to let its occupants leave. The supernatural isn't just the backdrop in paranormal fantasy, it really is the engine that drives the plot and everything else forward. So here's something I always really like to remind people. Genres aren't really neat little boxes. They're more like overlapping circles. And a book can absolutely be urban fantasy and paranormal fantasy. Take a story about a vampire detective solving crimes in modern day Chicago. That's urban fantasy because it's set in our contemporary world. But it's also paranormal fantasy because the supernatural is central to the story. Neither label is wrong. They are just highlighting different parts of the same book. So don't get caught up trying to find one perfect category. Genres exist to help readers discover books that they love, not to limit what a story can be. While we're here, there's one more distinction that's worth making. Paranormal fantasy and paranormal romance are not the same thing. They might both feature vampires, witches, or ghosts, but they're asking very different questions. In paranormal fantasy, the primary conflict is external. You're breaking curses, you're escaping haunted places, you're fighting supernatural creatures, uncovering ancient secrets, saving the town, stopping the monster. The romance, if there is one, supports the entire story. But in paranormal romance, it's actually the opposite. The relationship is the story. The vampire, the werewolf, or the witch is there because they create very unique challenges for the romance. A good rule of thumb is if you could remove the romance and still have a story, it's probably paranormal fantasy. If removing the romance and there's no story left, you're almost certainly reading paranormal romance. So, who do I think will love paranormal fantasy? If you're someone who enjoys stories that are mysterious, atmospheric, and just a little unsettling, the genre has so much to offer. It's also a fantastic choice if you've been curious about horror but aren't quite ready to dive into full on nightmare fuel. A lot of paranormal fantasy lives in the sweet spot that's between fantasy, mystery, and horror. You'll get eerie settings, supernatural mysteries, and plenty of tension without necessarily being terrified the whole time. And because the genre is so broad, you can find everything from cozy ghost stories to dark gothic tales. So if you start exploring paranormal fantasy, here are a few things that you'll probably see over and over again. First up, you have haunted houses, family curses, ghosts trying to communicate with the living, ancient artifacts with dangerous powers, psychics, mediums, secret magical bloodlines, immortal beings, forbidden rituals, possession, demons, angels, prophecies, and characters who discover that the world is far stranger and often far more dangerous than they ever imagined. So, where should you start if you want to start reading paranormal fantasy? If you love Gothic atmosphere, Mexican Gothic is an incredible place to begin. It's eerie, unsettling, and slowly builds one of the most unforgettable senses of dread I've ever experienced. If witches, history, and academia sound like your type of book, A Discovery of Witches blends magic, scholarship, and centuries old supernatural conflict into a story that's incredibly immersive. For something completely unique, The Book Eaters takes supernatural fantasy in a direction I've honestly haven't seen before. The premise alone is enough to hook you, and it only gets stranger from there. If you're looking for something that leans more heavily into horror while still feeling firmly rooted in fantasy, The Hollow Places delivers eerie alternate worlds, creeping suspense, and the kind of story that lingers with you long after you've finished. If you're wondering whether paranormal fantasy is for you, think about the kinds of stories that you already love. If you're a fan of The X-Files, The Haunting of Hill House, Stranger Things, Supernatural, or The Sixth Sense, you're already drawn to the questions that paranormal fantasy loves to ask. What if ghosts were real? What if curses could shape generations? What if there really are things hiding just beyond what we can explain? That is the heart of paranormal fantasy. I think paranormal fantasy is one of the most versatile corners of fantasy because it literally can be almost anything. Sometimes it's romantic, sometimes it's mysterious, and sometimes it is very deeply emotional, but also genuinely terrifying. What connects all of these stories isn't the setting or even the time period, it's our fascination with the unknown, with the things that can't be explained, and with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there are forces at work in the world that we don't fully understand. If those kind of stories have always pulled you in, paranormal fantasy is definitely a genre worth exploring. So, we've looked at fantasy that's hidden inside our modern world and fantasy that's driven by supernatural forces. But what happens when fantasy leaves behind medieval castles and starts embracing muskets, cannons, political revolutions, and the age of gunpowder? That's where we get one of fantasy's most fascinating and most underrated subgenres, Flintlock Fantasy. So, what is Flintlock Fantasy? Flintlock Fantasy takes the magic and imagination of traditional fantasy and places it in a world inspired by roughly the 17th through the 19th centuries. So, instead of medieval Europe, think the age of exploration, the Enlightenment, the Napoleonic Wars, you have the American and French revolutions, empires expanding across continents, you have professional armies replacing feudal knights, and then you have ships carrying soldiers and supplies across oceans. And of course, we have gunpowder. You will still find magic, though. You'll still find those monsters. You'll still find gods, prophecies, and political intrigue. But instead of charging in a battle with swords and shields, soldiers are firing muskets. Cannons are really reshaping entire battlefields, and military strategy becomes just as important as individual heroes. So, what makes Flintlock Fantasy feel different from other subgenres of fantasy? Honestly, the introduction of firearms really does change everything. And it's not just because guns are replacing magic, it's actually because guns are kind of changing how the entire world functions. Wars are going to be fought differently. Kingdoms are going to gain and lose power differently. Technology is going to begin to advance faster. Normally, you have trade expanding, and then even politics become very, very messy. The world actually starts to feel like it's on the edge of modern history. So while epic fantasy often feels ancient and timeless, Flintlock fantasy feels like a world that's already starting to change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. So this isn't just fantasy with guns, and I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions about this genre. A lot of people hear Flintlock fantasy and think, oh, so it's just fantasy, but somebody has a gun. Not really. If that's all it takes, then almost every fantasy book with a pistol would qualify for this genre. What makes Flintlock Fantasy unique is that the gunpowder actually shapes the entire world. Politics are different because of it. Military strategies are different because of it. The balance of power is different actually because of it. The technology will influence everyday life. So it's not just an accessory, it's part of the foundation of the entire setting. So this also leads into some really fascinating things that you don't always see explored in more traditional fantasy. You'll see stories asking questions like, what happens when old magic collides with new technology? Can tradition survive progress? Who controls power when warfare changes? What happens to old institutions when the world modernizes around them? Many Flintlock fantasy novels also spend a lot of time exploring colonialism, revolution, empire, class systems, and political corruption. So if you enjoy fantasy that has a little bit more historical depth and asks bigger societal questions, this genre has so much to offer. So who do I think should pick up Flintlock fantasy? First, if you already love epic fantasy, but you're ready for something that feels fresh, this genre is actually an incredible next step. Second, if you're someone who enjoys historical fictions, especially stories set during the Napoleonic era, the Age of Sail, or periods of political revolution, you'll probably feel right at home here. And finally, if you love books where military strategy matters just as much as magic, Flintlock Fantasy is absolutely worth exploring. These books often spend as much time planning battles and navigating political alliances as they do casting spells. So if you start reading Flintlock Fantasy, here are a few common tropes or things that you'll probably run into. Military academies, elite military units, muskets and pistols, cannons, sieges, battlefield mages even, political revolutions, royal succession crisis, secret conspiracies, expanding empires, magic integrated into military tactics, and plenty of morally gray leaders trying to decide how much they're willing to sacrifice for victory. So, where should you start? If you spent any time looking into this genre, you've almost certainly heard of The Promise of Blood. Honestly, there's a reason it comes up in almost every Flintlock fantasy conversation. It's widely considered one of the defining books of the genre, blending military strategy, political intrigue, revolution, and an incredibly creative magic system centered around gunpowder. If you enjoy large-scale military campaigns, The Thousand Names is another fantastic entry point. It has that sweeping historical feel while still delivering all the magic and world building that fantasy readers love. For readers who enjoy tactical warfare and morally complex characters, the Shadow Campaign series expands even further into politics, espionage, and the realities of maintaining an empire. If you want something with airships mixed into the equation, The Guns Above adds aerial combat to the Flintlock formula and is a really fun way to see how flexible this subgenre can be. If you're wondering whether this genre is for you, think about all the kinds of stories you enjoy. So if you love Master and Commander, Sharp, Hornblower, or even the political maneuvering and large scale battles of Game of Thrones, there's a good chance that Flintlock Fantasy will click with you. It's still fantasy, it still has incredible magic systems and unforgettable characters, but it trades medieval castles for military campaigns. And I think that's what makes it one of the most refreshing corners of fantasy. And I'll be honest, I think Flintlock Fantasy deserves way more attention than it actually gets. So many readers say that they're looking for fantasy that feels different from the medieval settings that they've seen over and over again. And this is exactly where I point them. It keeps everything we love about fantasy, that rich world building, those layered politics, the fascinating magic systems, but drops those elements into a period of history that's far less explored. If you've been feeling like every fantasy novel is starting to blend together, Flintlock Fantasy might exactly be the shakeup that you're looking for. So, we've talked about fantasy that's defined by setting, fantasy that's defined by the supernatural, and fantasy that's defined by a particular period of history. But what if the defining feature isn't the world at all? What if it's the hero? Let's finish with one of the fantasy's oldest and most enduring subgenres, heroic fantasy. So, what is heroic fantasy? At its core, heroic fantasy is a story about an extraordinary hero facing extraordinary challenges. Now, when I say hero, I don't necessarily mean someone who's perfect or even traditionally good. Some heroes are reluctant, some are flawed, some are morally gray, some would rather be anywhere else than on the quest that they've been given. What matters, though, is that the story is centered on their journey, their choices, their growth, and the obstacles that they have to overcome. The world around them might be fascinating, but it's not the main attraction. The hero is. So, what makes the subgenre feel different from others? I think one of the easiest ways to recognize heroic fantasy is by asking yourself this question: whose story is it really? In some fantasy books, the world almost feels like the main character. There are dozens of point of view characters, sprawling political conflicts, and even events unfolding across entire continents. Heroic fantasy zooms the camera in. Instead of trying to tell the story of the entire world, it asks us to follow one hero or maybe a small group as they take on a seemingly impossible challenge. The stakes can absolutely be world changing, but emotionally, the story always comes back to the individual. So let's talk about heroic fantasy versus epic fantasy. This is probably the biggest point of confusion. People often use heroic fantasy and epic fantasy as if they're the same thing. They often overlap, but they're not identical. Epic fantasy is usually about the fate of the world. You have multiple kingdoms, huge casts of characters, complex political alliances, wars between nations, ancient prophecies. The focus is going to be very broad in epic fantasy. But heroic fantasy asks a much more personal question. Can this one person overcome impossible odds? The fate of the world might still be hanging in the balance, but the emotional heart of the story stays with the hero. That's why a lot of heroic fantasy feels incredibly intimate, even when the action is massive. So, heroic fantasy is actually one of fantasy's oldest traditions. It isn't a new idea at all. Some of the oldest stories humanity has ever told fit comfortably into the heroic fantasy genre. Think about the Odyssey. It's not really about ancient Greece, it's about Odysseus trying to make it home. There's Beowulf. It's not really a story about kingdoms or politics. It's really about one warrior facing monsters that no one else can defeat. Even the legends of King Arthur often focus less on Britain itself and more on the individual knights and the ideals that they're striving to live up to. Heroic fantasy has been around for thousands of years because at its heart, it's telling one of our favorite kinds of stories, watching an ordinary or sometimes an extraordinary person rise to meet impossible challenges. So, who do I think will love this genre? If you're someone who gets deeply attached to characters, this genre is probably your sweet spot. There are books where you'll cheer for someone's victories, mourn their failures, and feel like you've just got a journey right alongside them. I'd also recommend heroic fantasy to readers who feel intimidated by some of today's massive epic fantasy series. Not everyone wants to keep track of 50 named characters, 10 kingdoms, and 300 years of fictional history. Heroic fantasy often gives you a much tighter, more character driven experience while still delivering everything that we love about fantasy. So, if you start exploring heroic fantasy, here are probably a few things or common tropes that you'll run into. You have a reluctant hero, a dangerous quest, ancient weapons or magical artifacts, impossible monsters, wise mentors, trials that test character as much as strength, friendships forged through adversity, sacrifice, redemption, and one defining moment where the hero has to choose who they're going to become. Those moments are really what makes the genre very memorable. So, where should you start? If you want one of the foundational works of heroic fantasy, The Hobbit is still one of the best places to begin. It's a deeply personal adventure that follows Bilbo's transformation from someone who wants nothing more than to live a quiet life into someone who's capable of incredible courage. If you're interested in classic sword and sorcery influences, Conan the Barbarian helped shape generations of fantasy that followed. These stories are fast paced, adventurous, and centered almost entirely on Conan's exploits. For something more modern, I'd recommend Legend. If you've never read this author before, this is a fantastic introduction. His books are known for unforgettable heroes, impossible battles, and characters whose courage inspires everyone around them. If you're looking for a series with lovable characters, clever adventures, and a strong focus on the journey rather than sprawling politics, The Rhaeria Revelations is an excellent choice. Royce and Hadrian have become one of fantasy's most beloved duos for a reason. If you're wondering whether heroic fantasy is for you, think about, again, the movies and stories that you already love. If you're drawn to The Lord of the Rings, Indiana Jones, The Princess Bride, The Mummy, or even classic myths like The Odyssey, you're already enjoying these kinds of stories that heroic fantasy is built around. These are adventures where the journey matters just as much as the destination, and where one person's choices can echo far beyond themselves. I think heroic fantasy reminds us why so many of us fell in love with fantasy in the first place. Yes, I personally love magic systems. I love massive maps. I love complicated political intrigue. But at the end of the day, the stories I remember most are almost always the ones that gave me a character I couldn't stop thinking about. Because no matter how incredible the world building is, it's the people that really make us care about the story. Heroic fantasy understands that better than almost any other subgenre of fantasy. So today we covered 4 fantasy subgenres that get confused all of the time. Urban fantasy asks, what if magic existed in our modern world? Paranormal fantasy explores what happens when the supernatural becomes the driving force of the story. Flintlock fantasy reimagines fantasy through the age of gunpowder, political revolution, and military innovation. And heroic fantasy reminds us that sometimes the most unforgettable stories aren't about saving the world. They're about following one remarkable hero through the adventure of a lifetime. I'd love to know which of these subgenres that you've read before, and if there are any others you'd like me to cover next. Fantasy is an incredibly diverse genre, and my goal with this series is to make it feel a little bit less intimidating and to help you discover the books that you might not have picked up otherwise. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more genre guides, book recommendations, and author interviews, and I'll see you in the next one.